Hello, my friends, and thank you for joining me for another exciting episode of Unseen Earth. There is a clay tablet sitting in a museum in London right now. It is cracked down the middle, it fits in the palm of your hand, and it contains information that the people who made it should not have been able to know. Not slightly advanced for their time, not impressively clever given their circumstances. We are talking about knowledge that took the rest of humanity another 5,000 years to independently rediscover. This is the story of the planisphere, and once you hear it, you will never look at the night sky the same way again. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share with others. Now, let's get into it. Before we get to the tablet, we need to talk about the people who made it, because most of what you were taught about ancient civilizations is incomplete, and some of it is simply wrong. Around 4500 BC, something happened in a region called Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. A civilization appeared, not slowly, not gradually, almost fully formed. They had cities, real cities, with populations in the tens of thousands. They had irrigation systems that transformed desert into farmland, legal codes that protected citizens and regulated commerce, schools where children were trained in reading, writing, and mathematics, banking systems that issued loans and tracked debts, long-distance trade routes spanning thousands of kilometers, connecting them to civilizations as far away as the Indus Valley. They invented writing, not as a creative or philosophical exercise, but because their economy had grown so complex, they needed a record-keeping system that human memory could not handle. The first written words in human history were not poetry or prayers. They were receipts, tax documents, trade ledgers, the mundane paperwork of a functioning economy. They invented the wheel, the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, the concept of dividing time into measurable, repeating units. Every time you glance at a clock or check the time on your phone, you are using a system that a Sumerian bureaucrat designed 5,500 years ago. And above everything else, above all their other achievements, they were obsessed with the sky. Not casually interested, not occasionally curious on clear nights, obsessed, in a way that consumed enormous institutional resources, generations of trained specialists, and left behind tens of thousands of written records that scholars are still working through today. They built observatories on the flat tops of their ziggurats, the massive stepped temple towers that dominated every major Sumerian city. They assigned dedicated teams of priests whose sole professional function was to watch the sky every single night without exception. Every visible object, every movement, every anomaly, every deviation from expected patterns. They believed the stars were not decoration, not background. They were a communication system. The gods wrote messages in the positions of planets and the movements of comets and the timing of eclipses. And if you could learn to read those messages, you could understand the fate of kings, the outcome of wars, the flooding of rivers, the rise and fall of harvests. So they watched, and they wrote, every night, for centuries. This was not casual stargazing. This was a multi-generational scientific program funded by the state and staffed by professionals. The data accumulated over generations was copied, preserved, cross-referenced, and built upon. Each generation of astronomers inherited the observations of the generation before them and added their own layer on top. By around 650 BC, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal had built what was arguably the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen. Located in his capital city of Nineveh, in what is now northern Iraq, it held an estimated 30,000 clay tablets covering medicine, mathematics, mythology, law, history, And deep inside the collection, hundreds of detailed astronomical texts representing centuries of accumulated observation. Star catalogues mapping the positions of hundreds of individual stars. Planetary tracking records following the movements of visible planets across years and decades. Eclipse prediction tables, accurate enough that Babylonian astronomers could forecast lunar eclipses months in advance. Observation logs going back generations, copied and recopied to preserve the knowledge as older tablets deteriorated. It was the most comprehensive astronomical archive in the ancient world, and it sat in Nineveh until 612 BC, when the Babylonians and Medes sacked the city. The palace burned, the roof collapsed, the greatest library in the ancient world was buried under rubble, where it would remain for 2,500 years. When British archaeologists excavated the site in the 1840s and 1850s, they found the tablets, thousands of them, broken and baked by the ancient fire, but preserved by it too. The clay hardened into something closer to ceramic than raw earth. They were carefully packed and shipped to London, where they were placed in the British Museum, and scholars began the slow, painstaking work of translation. Most tablets gave up their secrets relatively quickly, once the cuneiform script was decoded in the mid-19th century. But one tablet was different from the beginning. It was circular, about the size of a large dinner plate, divided like a pie into 8 equal segments, radiating from a central point. Each segment was filled with dense cuneiform notation, alongside geometric diagrams and angular measurements that looked like nothing else in the entire collection. Scholars catalogued it as K8538 and puzzled over it for decades. The leading theories were that it was a religious diagram of some kind, or perhaps a map of agricultural fields. Some thought it might be decorative. A few proposed it was a board game. Nobody could make the mathematics work. Nobody could figure out what the angular measurements referred to. Nobody could identify what the object in the center of each segment was supposed to represent. It sat on a shelf in the British Museum for over 120 years. In 2008, 2 British researchers named Alan Bond and Mark Hempsel published a book. Bond was an aerospace engineer with a background in rocket propulsion. Hempsel was an expert in astronautics and spacecraft systems. Neither of them was a traditional archaeologist or historian. Neither of them had spent their career in the ancient world. And that distance from conventional assumptions may be exactly why they saw what generations of trained scholars had missed. Using modern computer software capable of reconstructing the night sky as it appeared from any location on Earth at any point in history with extraordinary precision, they began systematically testing the notations on the tablet against thousands of possible dates and locations. The software could compute exactly where every star, every planet, every visible celestial object would have appeared in the sky on any given night from any given point on the surface of the Earth. Bond and Hempsel began feeding the angular measurements from the tablet into the system and looking for matches. What they found stopped them completely. The tablet was not a religious diagram. It was not a map of agricultural fields. It was not decorative. It was a precise, geometrically accurate, systematically recorded map of the night sky as seen from Nineveh on one specific night. June 29th, 3123 BC. Every notation in every segment of the tablet corresponded to the actual, verified position of stars visible from Nineveh on that exact night. The match was not approximate, it was not loosely suggestive, It was precise to within 1 degree of arc across dozens of completely separate and independent observations recorded across all 8 segments of the tablet. 1 degree of arc is the width of your little finger held at arm's length against the sky. The Sumerians were that accurate. Consistently, across dozens of measurements, on a single night over 5,000 years ago. The planisphere was exactly what its name suggests, a flat, circular map of the sky. And whoever made it had been on watch that particular night for a reason. Because something was happening that had never happened before in living memory. The tablet does not just record the positions of stars, it records something moving. That long, shallow path went across the eastern Mediterranean, across the Middle East, across Mesopotamia, directly over Nineveh. A Sumerian astronomer on a rooftop on the night of June 29, 3123 BC, watched a fireball cross the entire visible sky from one horizon toward the other, moving faster than anything he had ever seen, impossibly bright, impossibly low, trailing a column of fire and light that would have been visible for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. He had no framework for understanding what he was seeing, no word for asteroid in his language, no concept of objects from space striking the Earth, but he had a stylus, and he had wet clay. And he had spent his entire professional life being trained to measure and record whatever he observed in the sky with as much precision as his instruments allowed. So that is what he did. Of the estimated 500,000 cuneiform tablets recovered from archaeological sites across ancient Mesopotamia, scholars believe fewer than 1 in 10 have been fully translated and properly studied. Read that again. 9 out of 10 tablets are waiting. The British Museum alone holds tens of thousands of tablets that have never received a full scholarly analysis. Many are damaged. Many use technical vocabulary or regional dialects that modern Assyriologists are still working to decode. The entire field of Assyriology, the academic discipline devoted to ancient Mesopotamian languages and culture, is a relatively small community of specialists facing an almost impossibly large archive with limited resources and funding. We found the planisphere in the 1840s. We cracked it in 2008. 160 years to understand one tablet. We do not know what is in the other 90%. In recent years, teams of researchers have begun applying artificial intelligence to this problem. Machine learning systems trained on existing translations are being used to identify patterns in untranslated tablets and generate preliminary readings that human scholars can then verify and refine. The results so far have been genuinely surprising. Records older than previously documented. Astronomical observations more sophisticated than expected. Knowledge appearing centuries before we thought it was possible. Every time we open another corner of this archive, the story of human knowledge gets older and stranger and more humbling than it was before. There is a man in this story we will never know. He has no name in any surviving record. We do not know his age or his rank. We do not know if he was terrified by what he saw or simply professionally focused. We do not know if he understood that something catastrophic was happening to the northwest as he watched the object cross the sky. But on the night of June 29th, 3123 BC, he was on a rooftop in Nineveh, and he watched a mountain of rock cross the sky from one edge of his world to the other, and he measured it. The angle above the horizon, the speed relative to the fixed stars, the direction of travel, the brightness. He made 3 separate measurements from 3 separate reference points to cross-check his own observations, the way his training had taught him to do. He pressed the marks into wet clay with hands that knew exactly what they were doing and recorded what he saw with as much precision as 5,000 years of accumulated human observational skill had given him. He could not have known that his measurements would survive the fall of Nineveh. He could not have known they would survive Alexander the Great and Rome and the Middle Ages and 2 world wars. He could not have known they would sit on a shelf in a building in London for over a century, waiting for 2 aerospace engineers to finally understand what he had written. He just knew this mattered, that this night, this object, this trajectory needed to be preserved, that someone, somewhere, someday might need to know what crossed the sky on the 29th of June, 3123 BC. He was right. The sky above you tonight is the same sky he watched, the same stars in the same positions relative to each other, the same planets moving through the same cycles, the same asteroid belt he called the Hammered Bracelet, circling silently between Mars and Jupiter right now as you watch this. We have been looking up for a very long time. We have been measuring and recording and preserving and trying to understand for a very long time. We just keep forgetting how long. Look up tonight. Tablet K 8538, British Museum, London. Go see it.